In the history of flight, progress has always been written in both triumph and tragedy. From the fog-covered runways of Tenerife to the silent mountains of Japan, these are the stories of the moments when everything went wrong and the world of aviation changed forever. If you love real aviation history, mysteries of the skies, and lessons written in steel and flame, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us reach more viewers. Now, let's begin our journey. It began as a calm Sunday afternoon on a quiet island in the Atlantic and turned into the most defining moment in aviation history. On March 27, 1977, two Boeing 747 aircraft, operated by KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, and Pan American World Airways, both arrived unexpectedly at Los Rodeos Airport, on the island of Tenerife, in the Canary Islands. Neither flight was ever meant to land there. That morning, a security alert at Gran Canaria Airport forced dozens of flights to divert. Los Rodeos, a small regional field with one narrow runway, suddenly became overcrowded with wide-body jets never designed to fit its limited space. Taxiways filled quickly, and controllers were overwhelmed. Crews grew restless, passengers waited for hours, and a quiet sense of urgency began to settle inside every cockpit. Among those waiting was KLM's Captain Jacob Veldhuizen. Van Zanten, a veteran pilot, admired across Europe, even featured in the airline's own training materials. He had already spent much of the day on duty and was determined to depart before reaching his cruise time limit. When Gran Canaria finally reopened, he decided to refuel in Tenerife before takeoff, ensuring that once airborne, there would be no reason to stop again. It seemed like a smart move, but it would soon become a crucial piece of a growing chain of confusion. As the afternoon turned to evening, low clouds drifted in from the Atlantic, bringing with them a thick fog that settled across the airport. Within minutes, visibility dropped to almost zero. Controllers could no longer see the runway, and the pilots in the aircraft could barely see the taxiway lights. From that moment on, everything depended on radio communication and trust. The Pan Am 747, still waiting to depart, was instructed to taxi down the runway and exit through a side path. But the signage was poor, and the fog made it nearly impossible to see. The crew missed their turn. One small mistake that placed them directly in the path of the KLM aircraft now preparing for departure. Inside the KLM cockpit, the engines powered up as Captain Van Zanten completed his checklist. In the static-filled radios, voices overlapped. The controller's message, "Okay, stand by for takeoff, I will call you," was partially blocked by another transmission. To the KLM crew, it sounded like clearance had been given. "We're going," the captain said. The throttles moved forward, and the four massive engines pushed the jet into motion. As the aircraft accelerated into the fog, its crew could see nothing but the faint glow of the runway centerline. Ahead of them, hidden in the mist, the Pan Am 747 was still taxiing. Then, through the whiteness, its lights appeared. Inside the Pan Am cockpit, one of the pilots shouted, "There he is!" The captain tried to turn off the runway, applying full power to move aside. At that same instant, Captain Van Zanten saw the outline of another aircraft and pulled back on the control column, trying to lift the KLM jet before it reached the obstacle ahead. The massive aircraft began to rise, but only slightly. A moment later, the underside of the KLM jet made contact with the Pan Am aircraft. A bright flash lit up the fog, followed by an intense wave of fire and fuel. Both aircraft came to rest along the runway, their structures shattered and burning. When rescue teams reached the site, they found devastation stretching across the airfield. 583 people had lost their lives, making it the worst aviation event in history. Only 61 passengers, all from the Pan Am flight, managed to escape through openings in the fuselage before the fire spread. None of the KLM passengers or crew survived the impact. In the investigation that followed, it became clear that this was not a case of one error, but of many small ones aligning perfectly. A misheard radio call, a blocked transmission, fatigue, poor visibility, and human pressure all came together at exactly the wrong time. The accident revealed how fragile communication could be when clarity is lost. From this moment forward, aviation changed forever. The Tenerife event gave rise to a new philosophy known as crew resource management, a system that empowered every member of a flight crew, regardless of rank, to speak up, question decisions, and confirm instructions before taking action. It also standardized radio communication worldwide. Ambiguous terms like "okay" or "roger" were replaced by clear, direct phrases such as "cleared for takeoff" or "hold position." Even decades later, pilots still study Tenerife in training simulators, learning how miscommunication, not machinery, can bring even the most advanced aircraft to disaster. The runway at Los Rodeos remains in use today, though quieter, its edges lined with memorials, and its lights gleaming through the same fog that once blinded the world's largest jets. For aviation, Tenerife was not only a tragedy, it was a turning point. The day when the skies reminded humanity that technology alone cannot keep us safe, only understanding, clarity, and trust can. 8 years after Tenerife, the world witnessed another moment that would redefine how we understand safety, discipline, and courage in the air. It was the 12th of August, 1985, a clear summer evening over Japan. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747 Stradians, prepared to depart from Tokyo's Haneda Airport for Osaka, a short domestic route that was supposed to last less than an hour. On board were 524 people, families returning home, business travelers, and a skilled crew who had flown this route countless times. The 747 Stradians was a special short-range version of the jumbo jet designed for high-frequency flights within Japan's busy airspace. At 5:46 p.m., it lifted smoothly into the golden sky, climbing toward its cruising altitude. The first minutes were calm, the weather perfect, and everything seemed routine. Then, just 12 minutes after takeoff, the unimaginable began. A loud sound echoed through the cabin, a deep vibration, followed by an immediate loss of control. The pressure inside the aircraft suddenly dropped. Oxygen masks fell from the ceiling, and the jet began to oscillate, climbing and descending unpredictably. Passengers looked out the windows to see the tail section trembling. The flight crew, led by Captain Masami Takahama, immediately declared an emergency. But something far more serious had already occurred. The aircraft had suffered a catastrophic failure in its rear structure. 7 years earlier, in 1978, this same aircraft had experienced a tail strike during landing in Osaka. The rear pressure bulkhead, the part of the fuselage that seals the cabin, had been repaired improperly. Instead of a full circular reinforcement, a single row of rivets had been used. Over the following years, the repeated cycles of pressurization weakened the joint. On that August evening, at 24,000 feet, it finally gave way. The explosive loss of pressure tore through the rear fuselage, severing the hydraulic lines that controlled the aircraft's rudder and elevators. The Boeing 747 instantly lost almost all ability to steer or stabilize. Yet somehow, Captain Takahama and his crew refused to give up. Using only engine power by adjusting thrust on each side, they began a desperate attempt to keep the aircraft level. For the next 32 minutes, Flight 123 remained airborne. Radar operators on the ground watched in disbelief as the massive jet traced loops over central Japan, climbing, diving, and struggling to stay stable. Air traffic controllers offered headings and emergency landing options, but the crew could barely respond. Their voices, calm yet strained, revealed the incredible discipline of professionals fighting an impossible battle. Inside the cabin, passengers wrote messages on small pieces of paper, some addressed to family members, others simply expressing hope. Many believed they would survive, unaware of how critical the situation truly was. In the final minutes, The aircraft descended rapidly toward the mountains west of Tokyo. Witnesses on the ground saw the jet emerging from clouds, rolling slightly to one side before disappearing behind a ridge. Moments later, radar contact was lost. When rescuers reached the remote area the next morning, they found the aircraft scattered across a forested slope near Mount Takamagahara. The terrain was steep and isolated, making rescue efforts slow and difficult. Miraculously, 4 passengers survived, all seated near the rear of the cabin, where the impact forces had been lower. The official investigation later confirmed the root cause: a faulty repair performed 7 years earlier by the aircraft manufacturer. The improper joint had allowed fatigue cracks to grow, eventually leading to a structural rupture. What followed was not a mechanical issue alone, but a human one: the decision to approve a shortcut that met the schedule but not the standard. For Japan, the tragedy was more than an aviation event. It became a national wound, one that forced the entire industry to rethink maintenance, inspection, and communication. The manufacturer took full responsibility, introducing new global guidelines for repair documentation and double verification. The event also became a symbol of perseverance. The flight crew's 32 minutes of control with no hydraulics, no stabilizers, and no instruments functioning normally is still regarded as one of the most extraordinary displays of airmanship in history. Today, pilots around the world train on simulators that recreate the exact sequence of events from Flight 123. It remains a scenario no one is expected to survive, yet it serves as a testament to the determination and discipline of those on board. Decades later, Mount Takamagahara stands as a silent memorial. Families still visit the site, where the sound of wind moving through the trees is said to resemble the distant hum of engines. The lessons from that day continue to shape the world's understanding of responsibility and design. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was not only an accident, it was a mirror, reflecting how even the smallest flaw, left unnoticed, can test the strength of both machines and human resolve. The early 1970s were a time of progress and confidence in aviation. Aircraft were growing larger, faster, and more advanced, connecting cities and continents at an unprecedented pace. Among the newest marvels of the era was the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a trijet designed to carry hundreds of passengers across oceans with unmatched comfort and power. It symbolized the future of commercial flight. But on a quiet Sunday in March of 1974, that promise of progress collided with the reality of human error and design failure in a way that would echo for decades. It was March 3rd, 1974. Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was preparing to depart from Paris Orly Airport, bound for London. The aircraft, a gleaming DC-10 registered TCJAV and named Ankara, was nearly full, 335 passengers and 11 crew members. The route was short, less than an hour of flying time, and the weather was clear and calm. On the surface, nothing about this flight seemed unusual. But deep within the aircraft's rear fuselage, a flaw waited, a flaw already known to the manufacturer, but not yet fully corrected. The DC-10 had a large cargo door at the rear, designed to open outward rather than inward. This design allowed for more luggage space, but it also required a complex locking mechanism to withstand the difference in air pressure during flight. Engineers had identified problems with the door on earlier flights. The latch could appear sealed even when it was not fully locked. A simple misalignment, combined with improper maintenance or human error, could lead to a total failure of the door mid-flight. Warnings had been issued, but the modifications were slow to reach every aircraft. Flight 981 was among those still awaiting the fix. At noon, the DC-10 taxied out of Orly and took off smoothly into the cold Parisian sky. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. Passengers settled in for the short flight, and the crew began routine checks. Then, just over 10 minutes after takeoff, a sudden noise reverberated through the cabin, a deep thud followed by a violent vibration. The cargo door at the rear of the aircraft had burst open. The rapid loss of pressure caused the cabin floor above the cargo bay to collapse, severing the control cables that connected the cockpit to the tail. In an instant, the pilots lost nearly all control of the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, Captain Nejat Berkoz and his crew fought to regain stability. The DC-10 climbed briefly, then pitched downward. Air traffic controllers on the ground saw the aircraft veer off course. The crew's final transmission was a call for help, their voices strained but controlled. Moments later, the aircraft disappeared from radar. At 12:41 p.m., Turkish Airlines Flight 981 descended into the Ermenonville forest, just northeast of Paris. The impact shattered the tranquility of the countryside. When rescue teams arrived, the scene stretched across miles of woodland, a reminder of the scale and force involved. The investigation that followed became one of the most significant in aviation history. It quickly determined that the cause was not weather nor pilot error, but a mechanical design flaw that had already shown warning signs in earlier incidents. 2 years before, in 1972, an American Airlines DC-10 had suffered a similar cargo door failure shortly after takeoff from Detroit. That crew, by extraordinary skill and luck, had managed to land safely. The investigation into that event had already revealed the weakness in the door mechanism and recommended design changes. However, those recommendations had not yet been fully enforced by the time Turkish Airlines Flight 981 took off. Investigators from France, Turkey, and the United States examined every fragment of the wreckage. They reconstructed the sequence second by second. When the door blew open, the sudden decompression caused the cabin floor to collapse inward, cutting off all 3 sets of control cables. The pilots were left with no ability to steer, climb, or control pitch. The aircraft became aerodynamically uncontrollable within seconds. The chain of events was irreversible. This discovery sent shockwaves through the global aviation community. It was not simply a tragic mechanical failure, it was a breakdown of oversight and responsibility. The warnings had existed, yet the system that was supposed to ensure safety had moved too slowly. The result was catastrophic. In the months that followed, McDonnell Douglas implemented an extensive redesign of the DC-10 cargo door system. New locking pins were installed, viewing windows added, and inspection procedures standardized. Every DC-10 inches service worldwide was grounded until the modifications were completed. Regulators in the United States and Europe also revised certification procedures, demanding stricter testing for pressurized components. The event reshaped how aircraft design flaws were reported, verified, and corrected. For Turkish Airlines, the event left a lasting mark on its history. The airline was still expanding, still finding its place among the world's major carriers. Overnight, its name became linked with one of the most significant engineering failures of the jet age. But the lessons from Flight 981 would ultimately save countless lives. The new cargo door standards introduced afterward became mandatory across all future wide-body designs, from the Boeing 747 to the Airbus A300 and beyond. In the decades since, the forest of Ermenonville has grown quiet again. A small memorial now stands beneath the trees, surrounded by flowers and names engraved in stone. Pilots still study the event in training programs around the world, learning not only about engineering design, but about accountability. The idea that no warning, however small, can be ignored. The story of Turkish Airlines Flight 981 is not just about an aircraft or a design flaw. It is about a chain of decisions made by people in offices and hangars far from the cockpit that converged into a single moment of consequence. It showed that progress in aviation does not come only from technology, but from humility. Every safety regulation written since that day carries the imprint of those lessons. Even now, when a flight crew secures a cargo door and checks its locking indicators before departure, they are performing a ritual born from that March afternoon in 1974. In the world of aviation, safety is written in procedures, but its origin is always written in memory. By the mid-90s, the world's skies had become busier than ever. Air travel was trusted, efficient, and routine, but on one clear evening over northern India, that trust would be tested in a way no one expected. It was November 12, 1996, and two aircraft, a Saudi Arabian Airlines, Boeing 747, and a Kazakhstan Airlines, Ilyushin Il-76, were following routes that crossed near the small town of Charkhi Dadri, west of New Delhi. Neither pilot could see the other. They were separated only by altitude and a few seconds of time. At Indira Gandhi International Airport, air traffic controllers managed dozens of aircraft, arriving and departing in quick succession. Radar coverage was limited, and controllers depended heavily on pilots' radio reports to maintain vertical separation. That evening, Saudi Flight 763 had just departed New Delhi, climbing toward 14,000 feet. At the same time, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907 was approaching from the opposite direction, cleared to maintain 15,000 feet. If both crews held their altitudes, they would pass each other safely with 1,000 feet between them. But somewhere in the static of the radio, a misunderstanding occurred. The Kazakhstan crew, whose English was limited, believed they had permission to descend below 15,000 feet. As they began descending, the Saudi aircraft continued to climb. In the control tower, the radar blips began to converge. The controller called urgently for both planes to adjust their altitude, but there was little time. Moments later, at 6:41 p.m., the two aircraft crossed paths in open sky. A brilliant flash appeared against the dusk horizon, followed by silence. Ground witnesses saw fragments glinting in the air before descending toward the fields below. The incident claimed 349 lives, making it the deadliest mid-air collision in aviation history. When investigators from India, Russia, and Saudi Arabia examined the event, they found that the root cause was communication breakdown. The Kazakhstan crew had misheard altitude instructions and unknowingly descended into the flight path of the Saudi aircraft. Neither jet carried a collision avoidance system, which could have warned both crews in time. At that point, the use of such systems known as TCAS was not yet mandatory. After Charkhi Dadri, it became an international requirement for all large passenger aircraft. The report emphasized that the Saudi crew had followed every instruction precisely. The misunderstanding came from human factors, fatigue, language barriers, and a lack of clear radar coverage. For the controllers, who could only rely on estimated altitude readings, the danger appeared too late. Yet this tragedy transformed the way aviation handles safety. Within months, India expanded its radar network nationwide, and the International Civil Aviation Organization introduced new global language proficiency standards. Every commercial pilot would henceforth be required to demonstrate a specific level of English communication to prevent confusion during critical moments. Today, the airspace over northern India is among the most closely monitored in the world. Every aircraft now carries its own digital guardian, TCAS, a system that automatically detects nearby traffic and instructs pilots to climb or descend instantly. Whenever a pilot hears the mechanical voice say, "Traffic, traffic," it is a direct legacy of the lessons learned that evening over Charkhi Dadri. The open skies that once carried two invisible giants now hold a silent reminder that precision in words is as vital as precision in flight. It showed the world that even in perfect weather, it is not the clouds we must fear, but the gaps in our understanding. It was the evening of August 19, 1980. The sun had just begun to sink behind the desert horizon when Saudia Flight 163 prepared for departure from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The aircraft, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, gleamed beneath the orange light, its engines humming with steady confidence. Inside were 287 passengers and 14 crew members, bound for Jeddah on what should have been a routine domestic flight, lasting barely an hour. The cabin was quiet, the air thick with heat, and the calm rhythm of pre-departure checks. Nothing about that evening suggested the event that would soon unfold. At 9:32 p.m., the TriStar lifted from Riyadh's runway, climbing smoothly into the warm night sky. For the first few minutes, everything appeared normal. Then, just 7 minutes after takeoff, a faint smell of smoke began to drift through the rear of the cabin. At first, it was barely noticeable, the kind of scent passengers might dismiss as engine exhaust or a minor electrical issue. But within moments, it grew stronger. The flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, searching for the source. In the cockpit, the crew received an alarm indicating possible smoke in the cargo area. Captain Mohammed Al-Qawater and his first officer reacted immediately. Following standard procedure, they requested an emergency return to Riyadh. The control tower granted permission, and the aircraft began a wide turn back toward the airport. As it descended, the situation worsened. The smoke detectors continued to trigger, and passengers began to cough. The crew donned oxygen masks, communicating calmly with air traffic control as they lined up for landing. At 9:52 p.m., the TriStar touched down safely on the runway. To everyone listening on the radio frequencies that night, it sounded as though the worst had been avoided. But inside the cabin, the situation had become critical. The smoke was spreading rapidly, reducing visibility and making breathing difficult. The crew brought the aircraft to a stop on the runway and shut down the engines, expecting emergency vehicles to arrive within seconds. Yet, for reasons that investigators would later spend years trying to understand, the doors remained closed. No evacuation began. Airport fire crews surrounded the aircraft, but from the outside, the situation looked deceptively stable. There were no flames visible, no signs of external damage. Inside, however, the heat and fumes had intensified. Communication between the cockpit and the cabin was breaking down. It is believed that the captain, following checklist procedures, shut down electrical power before opening the doors, a standard safety step to prevent sparks in case of fuel vapor. In doing so, the internal lighting and intercom systems were lost. The passengers and cabin crew, disoriented and unable to open the heavy doors from inside, waited for instructions that never came. By the time firefighters opened the first doors from the outside, several minutes had passed. What they found inside changed aviation safety forever. The interior was filled with thick smoke and heat damage, evidence of an intense onboard fire that had burned unseen behind the cabin panels and insulation. The cause, investigators later determined, had likely been a small fire in the aft cargo compartment, possibly electrical in origin, that spread through ventilation ducts into the cabin. The official report noted that the aircraft had landed safely, but the absence of immediate evacuation proved fatal. There was no structural failure, no loss of control in flight, no impact, only a series of delayed actions and misjudgments under stress. It was a tragedy not of the air, but of procedure and timing. The event remains one of the few in aviation history where all occupants were lost after a successful landing. In the aftermath, international safety authorities re-examined every aspect of post-landing emergency management. New regulations required that passenger aircraft be evacuated within 90 seconds, even with half of the exits blocked. Crew training programs were rewritten to emphasize immediate action when smoke or fire is suspected. The event also changed cockpit procedures. Pilots were now instructed never to delay evacuation after landing, no matter how uncertain the cause. For the Lockheed L-1011 itself, this event became a defining moment. The TriStar had been one of the safest aircraft of its era, advanced, quiet, and reliable. But it also carried complex systems for air circulation and cabin pressurization, which investigators found could inadvertently feed a hidden fire. Design improvements followed, including heat-resistant insulation and smoke barriers in the cargo compartments. Today, aviation professionals still refer to Saudia Flight 163 as a turning point. It taught the industry that safety does not end when the wheels touch the runway, that time, clarity, and decisive action matter just as much on the ground as they do in the air. Modern aircraft now have advanced fire suppression systems, automatic alarms, and smoke evacuation vents designed to prevent any recurrence of such a scenario. Riyadh's night skies are quiet now, but for pilots, flight attendants, and safety engineers around the world, the lessons of that flight remain alive in every emergency drill, every training manual, and every checklist reviewed before takeoff. The voices of that crew, calm, professional, and hopeful to the very end, became the reason thousands of future flights would end differently. Saudia Flight 163 stands as a reminder that in aviation, survival often depends not only on technology, but on time and on the courage to act before it runs out. It was a bright spring afternoon in Chicago, May 25, 1979, the kind of day when O'Hare International Airport seemed to hum like a living machine. Dozens of aircraft lined up for takeoff, sunlight glinting off their polished fuselages, while controllers worked in rhythm, with engines roaring down multiple runways. Among them stood American Airlines Flight 191, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 bound for Los Angeles. It was one of the most modern and popular jets in service, known for its size, range, and power. On board were 258 passengers and 13 crew members, business travelers, families heading west for the weekend, and a seasoned flight crew who had flown this route many times before. At precisely 3:02 p.m., the DC-10 began its takeoff roll down runway 32 right. To those watching from the terminal, it was a familiar sight, a graceful giant lifting into the sky. But within seconds, everything changed. As the aircraft accelerated past 160 knots, witnesses saw something unusual. The left engine appeared to separate from the wing, twisting upward and over the top before breaking away completely. The aircraft continued to climb, seemingly stable for a moment. But what the pilots could not see was that the detachment had severed critical hydraulic and electrical lines. Within seconds, the left wing's leading-edge slats panels that help the wing generate lift retracted automatically, creating an asymmetrical lift condition. The aircraft's left wing lost lift while the right continued to rise. Inside the cockpit, Captain Walter Lux and his crew had no idea the engine had taken part of the hydraulic system with it. Their instruments still appeared normal, but the aircraft began to roll left. The captain tried to correct with opposite control input, but the DC-10 continued to bank. Altitude dropped rapidly. At 3:04 p.m., just seconds after takeoff, the aircraft rolled past 90 degrees and descended toward the ground near a trailer park north of the airport. The impact and ensuing fire were visible for miles, marking what became one of the most devastating moments in U.S. aviation history. The investigation that followed was among the most thorough ever conducted. The National Transportation Safety Board, assisted by engineers from McDonnell Douglas and American Airlines, began piecing together what had gone wrong. What they found would forever change how aircraft maintenance is performed. During routine maintenance a week earlier, American Airlines technicians had removed and reattached the aircraft's engines using a shortcut method designed to save time. Instead of removing the engine and pylon separately, as the manufacturer recommended, they had unbolted both as a single unit. This technique required a forklift to support the engine's weight during the process. A slight misalignment during reinstallation had caused an invisible crack in the pylon structure connecting the engine to the wing. Over several flights, vibration widened the crack until it failed completely during takeoff. The crew had no warning. The system had not been designed to detect such structural separation in real time. Once the pylon failed, hydraulic pressure was lost to the left wing, causing the slats to retract. Without the added lift, the left wing stalled, rolling the aircraft into an unrecoverable bank. For the aviation world, Flight 191 became a case study in how a single deviation from procedure, even one intended to increase efficiency, could have catastrophic consequences. The NTSB report highlighted the dangers of cost-saving maintenance shortcuts and emphasized the need for rigorous oversight. McDonnell Douglas revised its maintenance manuals to prohibit the combined removal technique entirely, and the FAA mandated new inspections for DC-10 pylons across all airlines. The event also reshaped how pilots were trained to respond to asymmetric lift and engine separation scenarios. In simulators, crews now practice maintaining control under partial hydraulic failure, emphasizing strict adherence to standard procedures. For American Airlines, the loss of Flight 191 led to an overhaul of its maintenance culture, focusing on documentation, cross-checking, and accountability at every level. The DC-10 itself went through a long journey of rebuilding its reputation. Despite a series of unrelated events in its early years, the aircraft would later prove reliable after structural and procedural upgrades. For many passengers, however, the image of that day, the aircraft climbing briefly before rolling left, remained imprinted in public memory. It became a moment that redefined how the world viewed the relationship between maintenance, regulation, and flight safety. Today, aviation engineers still cite the Flight 191 report in classrooms and training centers. It stands as one of the most detailed case studies in human factors, structural design, and the chain of command between manufacturer, maintenance crew, and regulator. The trailer park near O'Hare, where the aircraft came to rest, has since been redeveloped, but a small memorial stands quietly nearby, its plaques engraved with the names of those on board. Visitors describe the sound of passing aircraft overhead, a reminder that every safe takeoff today carries the legacy of that afternoon. In the history of flight, American Airlines Flight 191 became not only a moment of loss, but a blueprint for reform. It showed the world that even the most advanced technology depends on the discipline of human precision. Every maintenance log signed, every inspection performed, and every bolt tightened on an aircraft wing today echoes back to the lessons written that spring day in Chicago. It was the evening of January 1st, 1978, the first day of a new year, a time for celebration, optimism, and new beginnings. As the sun set over the Arabian Sea, the lights of Bombay, now Mumbai, shimmered across the coastline. At Santa Cruz Airport, Air India Flight 855 was preparing for departure to Dubai, a routine international service flown daily by the airline's flagship jet, the Boeing 747-200, known affectionately as the Emperor Ashoka. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, still exchanging New Year greetings. Some were heading home after holidays, others beginning a year abroad. For the flight crew, led by Captain Madan Lal Kukar, it was another familiar journey, less than 3 hours across open sea. At 7:02 p.m., Flight 855 lifted from runway 27, climbing westward into the night sky. The weather was clear, with only scattered haze over the coastline. The captain, a highly experienced former Indian Air Force pilot, engaged the autopilot and began a gentle left turn to set course for Dubai. But within minutes, something began to go wrong. The aircraft's primary attitude indicator, the instrument that shows whether the plane is climbing, descending, or banking, had failed. The display froze, giving the illusion that the jet was flying straight and level, when in fact, it had begun to bank slowly to the left. In the dimly lit cockpit, the crew's attention was divided between the dark horizon outside and the glowing dials inside. The sea below was invisible, a featureless black surface offering no visual reference. The captain relied on the faulty indicator to maintain level flight. His co-pilot, noticing the instruments showing conflicting information, voiced concern, but communication became tense. Within seconds, the gentle bank increased. The aircraft was now turning more sharply, descending slightly, without the crew realizing it. On the ground, air traffic control observed the radar trace of the aircraft beginning a slow curve to the left, then vanishing abruptly from the screen. In the cockpit, confusion grew as the artificial horizon remained fixed, while secondary instruments showed conflicting readings. Without an accurate attitude reference, The crew had no way to determine their true position. At 7:05 p.m., less than 3 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft entered a steep descent. The engines roared as the crew attempted to correct, but spatial disorientation had already taken hold, a condition where the brain cannot distinguish between upward and downward motion without reliable visual cues. Witnesses along the coast saw a brief flash of light far out over the sea, followed by silence. In just moments, the pride of India's national carrier had vanished below the horizon. Search operations continued through the night, but no survivors were found. All 213 people on board were lost, making it one of the most significant events in India's aviation history. When investigators began their work, they faced a challenge unlike any before. There were no flight data recorders recovered intact. No clear evidence of mechanical failure beyond the faulty instrument. What they pieced together through engineering analysis and flight path reconstruction was a story of human trust and how one instrument can shape the perception of reality in the cockpit. The attitude indicator on the captain's side had malfunctioned due to an electrical fault, freezing in a neutral position. The backup indicator on the co-pilot side showed the correct attitude, but under the stress of darkness, workload, and limited communication, the captain remained convinced his own instruments were correct. The report concluded that the event resulted from a combination of instrument failure, spatial disorientation, and the breakdown of crew coordination. The crew had entered what pilots now call an unrecognized bank, a situation where the aircraft slowly rolls without visual reference, often leading to loss of altitude before anyone realizes it. The investigators recommended major changes in flight deck design, including better instrument redundancy, clearer lighting, and improved crew cross-check procedures. The lessons from Air India Flight 855 were profound. Airlines around the world began emphasizing instrument cross-verification, the rule that no single instrument can be trusted without confirmation from others. Simulator training evolved to include night and instrument failure scenarios, teaching pilots how to recognize and overcome spatial disorientation. Manufacturers redesigned cockpits with larger, brighter, and more intuitive attitude displays, reducing the risk of misinterpretation during low visibility conditions. For India, the event was deeply personal. The loss came at a time when the country's aviation industry was growing rapidly, connecting its cities and linking its people to the world. The investigation and the reforms that followed became a cornerstone for modern flight safety practices across Asia. Today, the night sky over Mumbai glows with hundreds of departing aircraft, their navigation lights tracing red and white lines into the darkness. Every one of those aircraft relies on systems built, tested, and refined because of lessons learned from that evening in 1978. Flight 855 remains a powerful example of how even the smallest instrument fault, when combined with human trust and limited visibility, can redefine the meaning of control. It stands as a lasting reminder that in aviation, the horizon outside the window is never as important as the one inside the cockpit. It was a calm evening over South Korea's southwest coast on September 3, 2024. The air was clear. The approach lights at Muan International Airport shimmered in the distance, and Jeju Air Flight 2216 was on final descent after a short domestic journey from Jeju Island. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-800, carried 180 passengers and 7 crew members' families returning from vacation, commuters, and tourists heading home. The flight had been uneventful, the crew professional, the weather near perfect. But in aviation, sometimes it is precisely when everything feels routine that the smallest detail can shift the course of events entirely. As the aircraft descended through 2,000 feet, the crew received a sudden jolt, a sharp vibration, and a loud thud that echoed through the cabin. Passengers gasped as the plane shuddered briefly. Seconds later, cockpit alarms began to sound. Both engines had ingested a large flock of migratory birds just miles from the runway threshold. Bird strikes are a known risk in aviation, but rarely do they affect both engines at once. The right engine showed a drop in thrust and temperature, a clear sign of damage, while the left seemed stable but was producing irregular readings. Inside the cockpit, communication grew tense. The captain, assessing the instruments under pressure, believed the left engine had failed instead of the right. He called for the wrong engine to be shut down. The first officer hesitated, questioning the order, but the situation was unfolding fast. Within moments, the wrong throttle was pulled back, and the remaining operational engine was cut. The aircraft, now gliding without thrust, began to lose altitude rapidly. Air traffic control watched as the radar trace dipped below the safe glide path. The captain declared an emergency, attempting to restart the engines, but the altitude was too low and the distance too short. The aircraft's nose rose as they prepared for an emergency landing. Passengers braced as the lights flickered, and the cabin filled with the tense silence that always precedes impact. At 6:24 p.m., the aircraft made contact with the ground, short of the runway, sliding across the grass and breaking apart. The fuselage separated near the wing root, and small fires ignited along the belly section. Airport rescue crews arrived within minutes, pulling survivors from the wreckage and extinguishing the flames. The images that emerged later of the fractured fuselage resting in the twilight shocked a nation that had come to trust the safety of its skies. The investigation that followed became one of the most scrutinized in South Korean aviation history. The Aviation and Railway Accident Investigation Board quickly determined that the initial cause was a dual bird ingestion during approach, a rare but not unprecedented event. However, the key factor that transformed a survivable emergency into tragedy was human error, the shutdown of the wrong engine. The final report described a breakdown in cockpit resource management, a phrase that has defined so many lessons in aviation. Modern aircraft are designed to survive bird strikes. Engine blades are tested to withstand impacts, and airfields deploy radar and acoustic deterrent systems to keep flocks away from flight paths. Yet, when both engines ingest birds simultaneously, even the best technology can falter. What the Jeju Air event revealed was that the line between mechanical and human failure is often blurred. The sensors that showed conflicting data were functioning, but under stress, the crew misread them. In the months that followed, the incident triggered sweeping changes across Asian aviation. South Korea, Japan, and China jointly reviewed their bird strike prevention systems, introducing new radar tracking for avian activity near airports. Airlines began retraining pilots on dual-engine failure scenarios and emphasizing cross-verification during critical decisions. The one confirmation rule, requiring both pilots to verbally confirm any engine shutdown, became a permanent addition to standard operating procedures. For the passengers who survived, the images of that day remained a reminder of how fragile the margin of safety can be, even in modern aviation. The aircraft structure performed as designed, absorbing impact energy and allowing many to escape. For safety engineers, that fact became the only solace proof that decades of design evolution still mattered, even when human error intervened. Today, the approach to Muon is equipped with advanced wildlife detection systems, sensors that track bird movement in real time, and relay alerts directly to cockpits. Each flight that passes through that same airspace now does so with a layer of safety built from the lessons of Flight 2216. It stands as a reminder that progress in aviation is not only about faster aircraft or quieter engines, but about the constant study of mistakes and the courage to learn from them. It was the afternoon of June 18, 1972. The skies above London were heavy with low clouds, and a light drizzle swept over Heathrow Airport. British European Airways Flight 548, bound for Brussels, sat on the tarmac, a sleek Hawker Siddeley Trident jet painted in BEA's classic red and white livery. On board were 118 people, mostly British and Belgian passengers, along with a crew of 5. The Trident was one of the most advanced short-haul jets of its day, equipped with early forms of automation that promised a smoother, more efficient flight. But in just minutes, that promise would turn into one of the darkest chapters in British aviation. At 4 to 8 p.m., the aircraft began its takeoff roll down runway 2 to 8 left. It accelerated smoothly, engines roaring through the mist. Witnesses near the airport perimeter fence saw it climb sharply into the gray clouds, disappearing within seconds. Then, just moments later, the sound changed, a sudden drop in engine tone, followed by silence, and then the faint, haunting echo of impact in the distance. The aircraft had stalled shortly after takeoff and descended into a field near Staines, less than 2 miles from the runway. In the hours that followed, investigators from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch began piecing together the events of that flight. What they discovered would reveal not a mechanical failure, but a chain of human and procedural errors, magnified by fatigue and pressure. The captain, a respected and experienced pilot, had returned to duty after a long illness. Colleagues later described him as tense, determined to prove himself fully fit. That day's flight was operating under strict schedules, and departure delays had added further stress to the crew. As the Trident lifted off, the autopilot system was engaged almost immediately, a routine step, but one that required careful monitoring. The aircraft began to climb steeply, and the automatic leading-edge slats, designed to increase lift at low speeds, were retracted too early. At the same time, the engine power was reduced prematurely as the captain attempted to control the climb rate. These combined actions caused the jet to lose lift rapidly. The stick shaker, the control column's built-in warning for an impending stall, activated, but it was either misunderstood or ignored. Within seconds, the aircraft pitched upward sharply, then rolled to the left. There was no recovery. The final investigation determined that the aircraft had entered an aerodynamic stall at an altitude of just 1,700 feet, far too low for recovery. The slats, which should have remained extended during the climb, were retracted manually, eliminating the extra lift the wings needed. The official cause cited pilot error aggravated by fatigue, distraction, and misunderstanding of automation behavior. For Britain, the Staines event was a national shock. It became the worst aviation disaster in the country's history at that time. But from that loss came a transformation that still shapes aviation today. The tragedy exposed the growing complexity of cockpit automation and the need for clear, standardized communication among crew members. The British Civil Aviation Authority introduced mandatory crew duty time limits, ensuring that pilots received sufficient rest between flights. The concept of crew resource management, emphasizing teamwork, cross-checking, and open communication, was adopted across the UK and later worldwide. The Staines Memorial, located quietly near the crash site, bears the names of every passenger and crew member. Each year, residents and aviation professionals gather there to pay their respects, not only to remember, but to recognize how much of today's safety culture was built on their legacy. In the decades since, the principles learned from BEA Flight 548 have become embedded in every cockpit checklist and every simulator scenario. Modern flight decks now include multiple safeguards to prevent premature slat retraction, clearer stall warnings, and advanced flight management systems that prevent similar errors. When aircraft depart Heathrow today, banking gracefully over Staines on their climb to the continent, most passengers never know the history written in the skies above them. But for pilots and engineers, that small town marks a turning point. The place where aviation learned that technology can never replace communication, and that every safe flight begins not with the engines, but with understanding and rest.